All right, fantastic. Thank you everyone for filling out that poll, and welcome to our parent night for 2020. We're excited to have you all here. My name is Chelsea and I'll be your host tonight. I wanted to start by introducing our two presenters. So we have John Richard with us, our regional director in the South Peninsula region, as well as Kristen Juicy, our director of our Palo Alto office. We've gone through and curated the questions you've submitted in our registration form and built our presentation on working to answer those most pressing questions. If you do have additional questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type into the chat function or the Q&A function. We're going to have a dedicated Q&A at the end, so we'll make sure to get to all of those, but it could be that we could get to them throughout the presentation as well. If you have any questions throughout the presentation about technology, feel free to chat directly to me, and I'm happy to help there. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to John.
Hey, Chelsea. Hello, everyone. Excited to virtually see y'all here. So the first thing on our agenda that we're going to talk through are just the hard and fast dates, which are now, at least for the SAT, hard and fast. The College Board and the ACT have both announced their plans for the fall semester as far as dates. And for the SAT, I believe Chelsea is going to share this with you in a second here, but yeah, there it is. We have the next SAT date, which will be August 29th, 2020. SAT and SAT subject tests will be available on that date. The next one will be September 26th. And again, big note there, no subject tests. So if students are planning on taking those, they'll have to plan for August or October. And then the rest of the semester goes as scheduled initially. So October 3rd, November 7th, and December 5th, which is typically the cutoff for current juniors, so who'll be rising seniors next year. The College Board has also announced for all these dates that in the unlikely event that schools are not able to be reopened in some capacity this fall, the College Board will be providing a digital SAT for an in-home option similar to what they're doing with the APs this spring. The ACT, on the other hand, has actually kept its summer dates. So they have the June test, which is upcoming here in about a month now, June 13th. They've also announced a makeup date, should they have to move that back a little bit to June 20th. And they also have announced the same thing for their July test, which will be July 18th, with a makeup on July 25th. And their fall semester is also proceeding as scheduled with the September 12th, October 24th, and December 12th administrations. For rising juniors or rising sophomores, I guess there's a couple other classes as well that might be taking PSATs early for some reasons. The two dates that the College Board has announced will be October 14th, which is the midweek Wednesday administration that many kids take in the area, and there will also be the Saturday option on the 17th in the same month. So those are the dates which are upcoming. I know there's been a lot of frustration in the past couple of months with dates being canceled. But for both the SAT and ACT, we're excited to have a little bit of the assurance from both tests that should the tests have to be canceled again, they will be providing online options and making sure that those students are able to actually take those exams. I'm going to turn over to Kristen here, who's going to talk through the PSAT and SAT, and then I'll circle back on the ACT once we finish.
Thanks, John. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the PSAT, the SAT, what's kind of covered there, when students typically take these tests and whatnot. So I guess I'll start off with the PSAT, which I think many students typically see first in most occasions. So who takes the PSAT, I think, is a common question that we typically get. And the answer there, and I know that John had mentioned this just a moment ago, but some 10th graders take this exam. This exam is usually administrated in October. It's some 10th graders. I know that there are some schools in Palo Alto that have recently aren't administering that to 10th graders and just the 11th graders. And so I think for 11th graders, this is a test that juniors do take because in their 11th grade years when they can take this exam and qualify for the National Merit Scholarship. So we can talk about that in just a moment as well, but just to give you an idea of the breakdown of the PSAT and how that's scored, the scoring is a little bit different from what you would see on the SAT. So while the SAT is out of 1600, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, the scoring for the PSAT is slightly lower. So it is out of 1520 with a max on 760 in each section. So 760 for the math, and then 760 for the reading, writing, and language sections. There is no essay on the PSAT, so that is one thing that's not included on that test that the SAT does have. But what is it good for? So we often get that question too, is like, you know, what does the PSAT mean for my student if they're an 11th grader or even if they're a 10th grader? And I think when students are sophomores, the PSAT is great for gauging readiness for the SAT, you know, taking a look at just kind of the preliminary concepts that the SAT is kind of expecting from a student in their 10th grade year. It can help with, you know, testing core problem solving skills, which the SAT does kind of heavily focus on. And then, you know, does give early exposure, like I said, to the time testing and the format of the SAT. For juniors and those 11th graders, again, the PSAT is the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. So that NMSQT acronym that they see when you see that being administered like on a school calendar, that's what that stands for there. And the National Merit Scholarship, which we do have juniors come through to AJ and look for, you know, advice on how to best prepare for the PSAT to help with their chances in qualifying for National Merit Scholarship. So the way that the National Merit Scholarship kind of is calculated there is that they use the selection index scores that students receive for their PSAT. What that means is that when you guys actually receive your PSAT scores that your students take in October, I believe that those are typically released in December, so they do get them a couple months later. The score report actually reflects what they receive in each section, so the score that they would have gotten out of 1520 with a max of that 760 in each section, so they'll see a breakdown of what their scores were in each of those sections, and then they're also going to see like a selection index score on one of those pages. The highest being a 228 there. And then depending on the state, there are certain selection indexes that kind of determine whether students qualify for recognition, you know, going forward in the National Merit Scholarship process. So it is a process and a further application process down the line if students move on to the different rounds of like semifinalist and finalist. But students are able to qualify for that initial scholarship by taking the PSAT in their junior year. So kind of moving on to the SAT, the way that that's structured, and I'll dive a little bit deeper into this particular test because this is the one that I think many clients typically have questions about, just in terms of what does the SAT entail? Is it a good fit for my student? So as far as the sections and timing are concerned, that's where I'll start. The way that that test is formatted is it starts off with a reading comprehension section. As far as timing goes, it's about 65 minutes for that first section, 52 questions there. The section that follows that is going to be the writing and language section, which primarily tests a lot of the grammar concepts that students should know, organization, development, things of that nature that pertain to the writing and language that they're responsible for. That section is 35 minutes long with 44 questions. There will be a math, no calculator section. That section is typically 25 minutes long. There's 20 questions there. Something that's unique to the SAT is that the math sections do have both multiple choice and grid-in sections, which means that the sections are divided and first start with multiple choice questions that the kids can choose from A, B, C, and D. And then there are also grid-in questions. So there are grid-in questions to follow at the tail end of that section. So again, that third section is going to be a no calculator math section. The fourth section is going to be a calculator math section. So students are able to use their calculators. One thing that I always recommend to students before going into any SAT and also talking with them through the process is making sure that they know which calculators are allowed on the SAT. So there are some calculators that students are not able to use when they take the exam. So making sure that we have a calculator that is allowed to be used on the SAT during their actual administration is important. But for that math calculator section, that section's actually a little bit longer. So that section's going to be 55 minutes long. It's going to be 38 questions. And it's going to be divided the same way. So it's going to be some multiple choice questions to begin with, and then some grid-in questions to tailor off for that math section. So again, to recap, just kind of the 4 sections, the 4 multiple choice sections there on the SAT are going to be the reading section, the writing and language section, which is so reading comprehension, and then writing and language, which covers more of the grammar. There's going to be a math no calculator section, and then a math calculator section. And then the very last part is the essay. And if you look on the College Board website, or you even visit some school websites, I know that one of the questions that we get a lot too is, should I take the essay? It is noted as, parentheses optional on different websites and things like that. We always recommend taking the essay. It's 50 minutes long, but it does mean that should a student apply to a school that does require the essay still, that they're not, they're not short of that opportunity, right? So it doesn't hurt to take the essay. In fact, the essay doesn't affect the reading, writing, or language score either. It is like a separate score all on its own. And while it's optional, we usually tell our students that we require and ask them to take it, just so that at the end of the day, when they're filling out college applications, all doors are open versus, having to take the entire SAT again just to sit down to take that essay. So I can certainly answer any questions at the end with regards to more details on the sections and timing, but I wanted to kind of dive in a little bit to define those sections for you guys and give you an idea of what the students are kind of expected to know as far as, like, let's say reading comprehension. So I'd like to start there since that is the first section. So for reading comprehension, a lot of what students are tested on are things like main ideas, citing textual evidence, understanding relationships between passages, summarizing passages, knowing words in context. And while that doesn't mean necessarily, knowing concrete vocabulary, being able to piece together using context clues is something that the students are typically required there for reading comprehension. So lots of main ideas there, and strategies to tackle the reading section in particular is something that we coach as part of our programs. For the writing and language, they do test a lot of what I mentioned earlier, which is the English convention. So things pertaining to sentence structure, punctuation, the grammar, all of those things are kind of covered in writing and language. So they'll test those standard English conventions, give you sort of a passage to kind of proofread through and kind of piece together what is incorrect and what should be correct. They also do test the expression of ideas there. And what that means in terms of SAT is they're testing a student's ability to recognize the way a paragraph or a passage should be organized. So looking at organization and logic, looking at effective language use, and then the development of the different passages as well. So reading, writing, and language, the main difference there, reading is really underlying main ideas, like finding textual evidence and citing that, whereas writing and language concentrates a little bit more heavily on almost proofreading a passage and being able to identify, how to fix certain passages or develop them further. The math section is one that we get quite a few questions about too, because I know that this does have a little bit more, I guess in a sense, a little bit more background information required here. And so the categories that the SAT actually tests are hard up algebra. So what that entails is looking at things like linear systems, equations, inequalities, understanding the relationships between equations and graphs. So really those core algebra concepts that they would have learned in Algebra 1, Algebra 2. Another thing that they cover there is problem solving and data analysis. So that's another category of that SAT math. And these contents, the things that I'm covering right now are things that are covered in both the calculator and the non-calculator section. So it's kind of all encompassing here. So the problem solving and the data analysis sections really test, creating and analyzing relationships, looking at quantitative data, so looking at graphs, charts, being able to analyze those. And the very last thing too is passport to advanced math. So that would be the third category that many students have to cover or have to kind of be responsible for knowing and being able to identify on the SAT math. And what Passport to Advanced Math is typically, you know, manipulating equations, working with quadratics, you know, graphing exponential or nonlinear functions. Some core math is covered, so they'll cover things like areas, volumes, triangle relationships, circles, and as well as cover some things that are later on in Algebra 2, like a little bit of trigonometry. So I think as far as math goes, there is, you know, quite a little bit covered there. But we do, I think a question that I typically get from clients too is, you know, what math should my student be in? And I think that's a great question. I want to say that there's no pre-calculus on the SAT math, so they're not responsible for knowing pre-calculus or calculus, but Algebra 2 is a good one to have gotten through, as it does, like I mentioned, cover some of those trig functions at the end, which I think many students, based on the curriculum in the area, usually see in late Algebra 2. Scoring for each of the sections is typically out of 800. So the reading, writing, language are scored together, and the math sections are scored together to get a score out of 800. And then your total score that the students see is going to be out of 1600. For registration for the SAT, so I know John had presented some of the dates for the SAT, the dates that are coming up. Registration does open this month, so I want to advise, you know, that you guys are checking the College Board pretty regularly, make an account on there. If you already have one on there, definitely check student emails pretty regularly. I'm advising my students right now to even check their emails daily, check their College Board registration daily, just to kind of get a sense of, you know, when that opens. And when it does open, I know with all of the cancellations this past spring, I know it's probably going to be, you know, going pretty quickly as far as like registration goes. So as far as seats go, I know that that can be competitive on a normal season. So I would definitely recommend setting up an account and maybe signing up for email reminders so that once registration opens, you guys kind of have priority registration there. Students who have been registered for June or are rising seniors, so they're juniors now, they're going to be seniors down the line, with no SAT scores will likely have priority registration status for the August, September, and October dates. So if you're one of those parents in that boat where your student was a junior this year, their tests may have gotten canceled because they were registered for June, they likely will have priority registration status, and I would check student emails and the College Board pretty regularly to make sure that you can, you know, register for a seat in August if that's when you plan on taking that exam. So I'll go ahead and pass this over to John so he can talk a little bit about the ACT and break that, that test down a little bit more for you guys.
Cool, thank you, Kristen. Okay, ACT. So the ACT, like the SAT, has 4 sections plus the essay. The main difference is that instead of 2 math sections, the ACT has a math and a science section. So the order provided will be grammar, writing a language first, then math, then reading, then science, and lastly, the optional essay. As far as the breakdown on that, the grammar, writing, and language section is 45 minutes and it comprises 75 questions. The math is 60 minutes and 60 questions. The, what did I say next? The reading. The reading is 40 questions in 35 minutes, and the science is the same, 40 questions in 35 minutes. The essay at the end, like the SAT, while it is optional, some schools do require it, so we typically recommend that students go ahead and sign up for it, even if it is a little bit of a drag to take that at the end of a 4-hour exam. It's definitely better than having to realize you have to retake the exam last minute, and the essay is 40 minutes at the end of the test. So what is the ACT test? A lot of this is somewhat repetitive. So the grammar section, for example, is very similar to the SAT's grammar. In the redesign that the SAT did a couple years back, one of the things that we noticed coming out of that was that the SAT and the ACT actually got closer together, in particular on that grammar section. So there's a lot of the same rules tested, the same punctuation. It is obviously faster paced, given the number of questions that are provided there, but typically the questions are somewhat easier. The second section, the math section, is, again, the one that's most content heavy, and students really do need to be, well aware of that going in. The math is progressively more difficult, and by the end of the test, it does comprise a fair bit of trigonometry and precalculus. So students who are currently, as a junior, let's say, are currently taking geometry or algebra 2 might not have seen all the content that they're going to need to see. And we definitely would recommend for most students, if they're going to be juniors next year, and if they are taking algebra 2 or trig pre-calc, that they might want to push the test off a little bit until they've got a little more of that content under their belt. Whereas if they have taken algebra 2 or trigonometry, something along those lines, they are ready to roll as far as the content goes there. Again, much like the SAT, it does get progressively more difficult as it goes, but there is no grid-in section and there is no non-calculator section. So students are going to have access to that calculator the entire time. The reading section is third section, and again, it tests very similar things to the SAT, but the format is much more fast-paced and less concentrated on difficult summarizing questions and understanding the main point. It's a lot more similar to the way most students actually like to read, which is kind of rushing through things and getting a basic idea of where things are in passages. So students often prefer that aspect, even if it is fast-paced. But again, the question styles are mostly the same. Some of the question approaches, like the contextual evidence questions, are not focused on the ACT as they are on the SAT. The fourth section, the science section, is the one I think we get the most unsureness about. A lot of students come in thinking, wow, do I need to know physics and chemistry and biology? And I'm only a sophomore right now. I've only taken one or two of those, or a junior. And the answer to that question is a big no. You do not need to have understood or even learned rather much about any of the sciences to ace the science section. It's much closer to what the SAT calls data analysis. There's a lot of reading charts and tables, and it definitely helps to have kind of an idea of what they're talking about. But I would say out of the 40 questions on an individual science section, for 38 to 39 of them, you can get away knowing zero science. And even when the science is actually what's being tested and there is some content, it's largely fairly basic things that most students are aware of, such as, is Jupiter a big planet? Or what is the equation for photosynthesis, more or less? As far as the scoring goes, it's a little simpler. It's just a solid whole number out of 36 for each subsection. And then the way the overall score is given is it's just an average of those 4 subsections. The essay is scaled on a 1 to 12 scale, and it is not included in the overall score, much like the SAT. So a student could, conceivably, if they got like a 28 on the reading and the science, and then a 26 on the math and the verbal, would score a 27 overall. As far as the plans here for the ACT, again, they've been a little more hopeful that they're going to be able to host their tests in June and July. So those tests are still on, as I mentioned earlier. Those are the only tests you can register for currently. July, I believe, is pretty full, although they are opening new test centers as time goes on here. There are still seats available for June. Students can definitely register for those and take a look, but checking to see when spots open up is definitely encouraged if they are aiming to take one of those too. And the makeup dates, should they have to push those dates back, are already scheduled on the calendar for the ACT as well, although again, they're only going to be using those if they are unable to host the June and July test dates as scheduled. Registration for the fall dates for the September exams and onward will be open after the July test happens, so in July, a couple months from now. And there are some big changes coming to the ACT in the fall. So this was actually prior to any of the COVID stuff going on. The ACT announced that they were going to start debuting ACT computerized tests. These were going to be hosted in proctored facilities, and the hope is they would still be able to do so. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background there on how that would work, because it is a little bit different than the old-fashioned paper and pencil one. The ACT online exam will allow students who have taken a full ACT already, either in February or sometime in the fall last year, or if they're going to take this June or July one, someone that's taken one of those tests beforehand will be able to sign up for the September option with the computerized online version. And the difference here will be that you'll be able to take certain subsections rather than the entire test. So let's say a student, who did really well on the math and the reading sections, but a little more poorly on the science and grammar sections, and wants to retake, but doesn't want to ruin their great math score, or just doesn't want to sit for 4 full hours, they'll be able to sign up to take just those 2 sections, the science and the grammar, I think are the 2 I mentioned that they hadn't done so well on, but they'll be able to take just those 2, or the essay or whatever, whatever it might be. So in total, students could take as many as 3 of the individual subsections, including the essay, as part of that retake. Colleges will be more open to receiving the super score tests in that regard than they had been in the past for the ACT. But we're still recommending for kids, typically to plan on taking the full test the first time. For sure you have to, but even later on, for many kids, it's going to make sense to retake full test, just because you can always do better even if you do really well the first time, unless of course you do get an actual perfect score. The full test will still be available on paper and pencil, as it always has been. Although again, much like the SAT, the ACT has announced that should they be unable to host the tests as they scheduled, as they hope for in person, they will also be working on a computerized at-home test in the late fall and early winter here. My guess is that one will probably be ready to go a little bit sooner, just seeing as they had already planned on this semblance of this kind of online testing as it is. So my guess would be it'll be ready to go right away. But more to come on that, and the hope is they will be able to host them as they normally do. And okay, let me think here. Was that all I had to think about on the ACT? Okay, on our end at AJ, we've been working to develop our own versions of the online tests here for both the SATs, should that end up happening, but also for this current version of the ACT that's going to happen for sure, the online subsection rescoring test. So we are working now to have that set up so students will be able to model that experience even at their homes right now while they're getting ready to prep for these tests, if they've already taken them once and want to sign up for that version. It'll be the same exact experience where they're able to choose which subsections they want to take as part of their retake. All right. As far as the differences, I'm gonna let Kristen kind of outline some of the main differences, but one of the things to focus on before we even go there is just that, especially for you rising juniors, the decision often seems like a really binary one, like it's SAT versus ACT. And the only thing I would say about this is that they are, especially since the change a few years back, are more similar than they used to be. And so, students are often able to take one test and, prepare for it really well, and then take the other test and do quite well on that as well if they do want to give it a try. There is a lot of overlap between the two. So Kristen, do you want to, highlight the differences, the pros and cons, which students might do better for which?
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. So talking about like the SAT versus the ACT, so typically what we see off the bat is that 80% of students do the same on both. Usually if a student does show affinity for one, it's after preparing for both exams. So it's after seeing a little bit more of the SAT and after seeing a little bit more of the ACT, understanding the format, the timing, all of that usually contributes to whether, a student shows, a preference for a particular exam. But what we typically see when we do diagnostics or when students take an SAT and take an ACT just to see kind of where they're at is that 80% of those students do get the same equivalent score on both. So I guess we can talk a little bit about pros and cons of each test. So the SAT that we talked about, that I talked about just a moment ago, a couple of minutes ago there, is a test that does rely, I find, to be a little bit more centered around critical thinking and a deeper understanding. So a lot of the questions in the reading comprehension, and John alluded to this when he was talking about the ACT, is that the SAT does sometimes present as a little bit more difficult because it does test a lot more heavily on understanding main ideas and having an understanding between, the connections of the different parts of a passage. the math questions on the SAT. So for a student that really likes problem solving and being able to approach problems in many different ways, I find that many of my students who love the math section on the SAT find 2 or 3 ways to solve a different problem, or to solve the same problems, that they can approach the math questions, you know, with lots of different test taking techniques or different problem solving based on what they've learned in the classroom. There is more time per section on the SAT. So when we talked about timing earlier, typically there are fewer questions than there is time on the SAT. So the timing is a little bit, some students who are concerned a little bit about timing on the sections and feeling rushed, sometimes they like the SAT because of the timing there. So for instance, the reading section, typically 52 questions there, but 65 minutes to tackle it, versus the reading section on the ACT, which is 35 minutes, but 40 questions. So less time than there are questions there. So there is more time per section. Another main difference there, I think, is that the SAT essay is quite different from the ACT essay. So the SAT essay is more of an analytical essay, maybe something that a student would see in maybe like an AP literature class. So looking at literary devices and really analyzing an author's technique, versus the ACT, which is more of like a persuasive essay. To go a little bit more into the ACT, I find that students who like a straightforward test, right, knowing what to kind of expect there with the questions, the ACT does present that way, a little bit more straightforward. Oftentimes the math section does look, some of the problems look similar to what they see in the classroom. The reading section, as John had mentioned as well, is a little bit more straightforward, where the students can kind of speed through and still answer a good number of the questions, even if they weren't able to get like a chunk of maybe a deep main idea in one of those. So the reading section does present a little bit more straightforward. And then the science section itself is, again, like a data analysis section. So it doesn't necessarily require, you know, a deep understanding of biology or chemistry or physics, but rather an understanding of how to read charts and graphs in a strategic way. So for students that like, you know, maybe a straightforward test or like a faster paced test, like they feel like timing's maybe not an issue for them, the ACT is sometimes a good fit there. A definite pro, I think, is that the ACT, we do have now the ability to retest individual sections. So as John had mentioned, you know, if a student is not super fond of like their reading and science score, they can, and those are the last 2 sections of the exam, they can opt to sit for the ACT and simply retest for reading and science come September 2020. So that's one of the changes that is happening around the ACT at this time. We talked about it being a little bit more fast-paced. So for students who do struggle a little bit with time, the ACT can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge because it is about knowing how to strategically make your way through a section given the amount of time that we have. So the essays, again, are a little bit different there, and I think really it's familiarity with the test and how it presents. There is a lot of overlap between the tests nowadays. John had mentioned this as well when he talked about the ACT English, is that there's a lot of overlap between that section and the SAT writing and language section. So there is a lot of overlap between these sections. The math concepts, a lot of the core math that you need to know on the SAT is also present on the ACT. Although, as we had mentioned earlier too, the ACT does get into a little bit more difficult math as you do reach the end of that section. The reading is, you know, I think one of the major differences there though. So I think sometimes that makes a difference in a choice that a student might make. And again, we do, if there's any question about, you know, what, I'm still kind of unsure about what my student, you know, what kind of test my student would be best suited for, we do have something at AJ called our hybrid diagnostic exam, where we can kind of assess like a student's strengths and weaknesses, and they can get a little bit of exposure to, you know, the SAT and the ACT to kind of get a feel for what those sections kind of look like. But again, so to recap that, most of the students do the same on both. So I would say like 80% of our students typically do the same when they take some kind of diagnostic, unless they've seen a little bit of the SAT or the ACT to begin with and had a little bit of preparation under their belts. And with that being said, I'm happy to answer additional questions about SAT versus ACT, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to, when to kind of think about deciding this down the line here in our talk. But I'm going to pass this over to John so that he can discuss subject tests, which I'm sure that, there might be some questions surrounding SAT subject tests as well, especially given some of the cancellations this spring. So I'll pass it over to John.
Okay, so SAT subject tests. Most students who line up to take these are either sophomores or juniors currently. And they usually take them right around this time, right around APs. They take them in May and June. And obviously this year, unfortunately, that is not able to happen. So students are going to have to be revectored to the fall exams. As I mentioned before, the September exam that was added by College Board is not going to be hosting subject tests. So if students do want to plan on taking those, we're typically recommending that they take them in August and then take the SAT in September, primarily because the subject tests are more content-based tests. One reason we try to recommend that students typically take them in the May and June timeframe is that for many of them, especially if a student is in an honors or an AP class, the studying that they'll need to do to prepare for these exams is relatively minimal, even for the more upper level ones. So we'd probably recommending that they aim in August. The subject tests are all the same format and structure in the sense that they're all 1-hour exams. Students can take up to 3 in one day. And the max that any college recommends/requires would be 3. At this point, there are not too many schools which do hardline require SAT subject tests, and especially for this year, given the nature of the coronavirus impact on students, more schools are going to be even more so looking and saying, hey, if you have them, that's awesome. We'd love to consider them, but they're not going to be part of our necessary requirement deadlines. But we still recommend students take them, especially if they were, really a strong suit for them in their classes. It can really show them off and really highlight to the colleges that not only were they able to pass the class with their teacher and do a great job there, but also apply this to a standardized test that other students are taking, and they can really view on an equal playing field. For the most part, students typically are looking at subject tests for the sciences, physics, chem, and bio, or the languages. Spanish and French obviously are the big ones out here, although if your student happens to be a native speaker, that could be a great fit. And then the histories as well. But the primary two that most students will end up taking are the Math 2 subject exam and the SAT Literature subject exam. And those two in particular are probably the two of the most straightforward tests to prepare for. Math 2, although it is a little bit higher on the content level, it is trig and pre-calc. So students who haven't taken those classes are typically not in a great position to really excel. But if they have, and even if they've only taken like an upper level Algebra 2 course, they at least have a shot here. Those tests are probably the most coachable, the most predictable, and the most repetitive of all the different tests that a student might be taking. For the literature, they recycle the same passages, and for the Math 2, they recycle many of the same Math 2 concepts and questions time and time again. So they're, again, fairly coachable tests. As I mentioned before, most schools do not require them, but certain programs do. Like if you're applying to a school, and you're applying to go as a pre-med or engineering for your undergrad, they might be requiring, or at least highly recommending, that you have a couple of those under your belt, usually a math and a science for a program like that. As far as what we at AJ are doing here, just one quick thing, we do realize that students are, obviously a little bit under pressure because they meant to take these in May and June, and now they're going to be having to take these in August, likely. We are going to be working with students over the summer for more extended bridge programs. We haven't yet nailed down exactly what our offering will be, but it will be a discount on our normal rates to help students get through and take those tests, with the idea that we know they're going to need a couple extra sessions to go over the main concepts that they might have missed from the end of the school year, and or just might get rusty as the summer kind of persists here. And it's like 3 months since they've actually looked at any of the content. So we'll be rolling more information out about that soon. And then again, just kind of thinking about the differences between the types of the subject tests, we would consider the Math 2 and the literature more skills-based tests. They're easier to prepare for and coach for even if you're further removed from the actual content. So again, a student who maybe was all keyed up to take chemistry and now is feeling like, wow, I really can't retain all that information, taking a look more at the Math 2 and the literature might make a lot of sense. The content tests like physics, chem, bio, the languages, etc., will require students to really be on their toes and be doing a lot of studying over the summer as they prepare for that August exam. Any student can take these tests. We obviously seniors wouldn't bother at this stage. They're on their way out, even in normal times. But juniors, sophomores, even freshmen can take them. We typically only recommend them, though, if students are in an honors class or an AP class, obviously, or if it's the last time they're going to take that test. Like if they're only going to take 1 year of biology and they really want to have that biology subject test done, even if it's a freshman year, you might consider taking it a little bit early. The way the subject tests are scored, they're all out of an 800 score. So just like the same as an SAT subsection. Typically the curves are far more generous. So a student like on the Math 2 might miss 5 or 6 questions out of the 50 questions and could still attain a perfect score, an 800 on the Math 2. That's about it for subject tests. Again, they're not part of every student's kind of necessary testing guidelines, but for students who are advanced in particular or are looking at applying to more elite programs, they're definitely highly required and can really differentiate a student, especially in these times where many students are unable to take tests. If your student is able to take these and has the stamina to keep studying for them and take them in the fall, it can be a huge benefit on an application to see those exams. Chris is going to talk a little about timelines here, and obviously there's a lot of different timelines, and this year is going to be a little bit different for many kids anyways. But we're going to talk a little bit more about the general structured timelines for most students, and then we'll definitely open up to some questions on timelines and things of that nature given the impact right now.
All right, so thanks, John. Just kind of leading into timelines. I've been doing this for quite some time now, and one of the things that we definitely notice as a team is that timelines aren't one size fits all. I'm the office director over in Palo Alto, and I get many parents that walk through that door and they want to know because, friend A told them one thing about, their student's timeline, and then the counselor is telling them something different, and they want to know, what makes sense for my student. And that's totally valid. And we are, definitely well equipped to handle those questions and help you guys navigate timelines for your specific student and what their specific situations are. As far as like typical preparation, a typical preparation and what that looks like is that the base kind of recommendation that we typically kind of start with is that we like to recommend at least 10 sessions in advance of the SAT or the ACT. So 10 sessions in advance of your actual first test date. That usually is, an efficient and good enough amount of time to get through a lot of the content that's covered on those exams, cover a lot of the core, test taking strategies that are associated with that, a large enough timeline for us to recommend and help students plan taking practice tests with us to kind of implement a lot of the strategies and the content that we're teaching during session. So that would kind of be a more full prep. Some students do a little bit more than that, just depending on what their timelines look like or how they feel they're progressing at the beginning of their preparation. Maybe some students are, wanting to take a little bit more time to develop it further in a particular section or a skill, in which case sometimes they opt for, allotting for a timeline that allows for more than 10 sessions. Going off of that full preparation, many times we have students who want to try their hand at both, and that's never a bad idea, I don't think, in terms of wanting to know how you did on the SAT and how you do on the ACT, right? So we do have something called our hybrid preparation program, which is where we prep a student for, let's say, the SAT in full, and then use like maybe 4 sessions to help them transition to familiarizing with the differences between the SAT and the ACT, and helping to equip them with the proper strategies that help them tackle a test like the ACT, which is slightly different from the SAT. That, and then we do have students that like to get started a little bit earlier. So they'll maybe want to take a preview at, you know, what's to come with the SAT. Maybe they're, you know, they have a free summer. I think that's a request that we're kind of getting, you know, now in these coming weeks is, you know, my student has a lot of time on their hands, given the changes with school and what our summer camp plan was. You know, what do you think about a preview to the PSAT or the SAT? And we certainly can design a preparation around that as well if a student wants some early exposure to some of these kinds of topics here. So what we've done, and this is the part where I actually do have a couple slides for you guys, is I kind of want to talk through a couple common case studies that we often see, so that you guys can kind of get an idea for how we kind of map out these timelines for different types of students. And of course, the 3 categories that I'm going to share with you now are not limited to only these 3. So if your student doesn't fit specifically in this box, there's certainly a timeline that we can curate for them that makes a lot of sense for their particular activities, the classes that they've taken so far, where they're comfortable, and just kind of generally, you know, when are they busy? What does their first semester or second semester look like? So again, these are just a couple examples that we can kind of talk through just so you guys can get an idea of how we kind of map out timelines with our parents and with our students. So with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen here. If you guys can see this here. So the first timeline that we're looking at here is what we call the ambitious all-star. So recommended math at this juncture is kind of pre-calculus or higher. So that's typically where some of the students are at this point. Maybe they have a bunch of other AP classes or honors classes on their schedule. A good plan here might be to go light in the fall and then maximize some spring studying, right? Going light in the fall to kind of get acquainted with the school year, what their workload looks like, and maximize some studying during the springtime. And what that might look like would be outlined here, right? So we have like the, maybe to prep for the PSAT and do some light prep in the late summer to prepare for that October exam. We'll plan for the March SAT, which is that spring test, right? The first test that comes up in spring for the SAT, and likely begin full prep starting in the first week of January. So we can allot for some time to fit in those 10 sessions and maybe have some cushion if, you know, the student gets sick, or there's a week that they're particularly busy taking, you know, a midterm, or they have 3 tests in 1 week. You know, allotting for some cushion there, I think, is always a good idea. A common hybrid preparation that we see is transitioning between the March SAT and the April ACT. So doing some light hybrid preparation in March or April. Maybe taking some subject tests in May that correspond to a student's AP classes. Typically, the May subject tests fall the weekend before, so the schedule was a little bit different this year, given the changes to, you know, with the coronavirus, there were some changes and disruptions to the AP testing schedule, and I think our students are currently going through that AP testing process right now online. But tests that correspond to their AP classes, the May SAT typically is the weekend before AP week begins. So in the last couple years, it's fallen that way. So this might be a great way if students, you know, are wrapping up AP biology by the time that they take their AP exam. Bio subject test might be a good one to take just at the tail end of that course because they'd have learned all of the material by then. Math 2 and Lit are also 2 really coachable exams that can be taken here for subject tests. And then this opens up the opportunity to do retakes in June, right? So either an SAT retake or an ACT retake. The nice thing about the SAT and ACT, I guess, is that they are administered by different administrations. So the SAT is administered by the College Board. The ACT has its own organization. So if a student just really didn't like their ACT score or their SAT score, they can just opt to retake whichever test that they preferred more and send those scores instead to their schools. The ideal plan would be to, you know, be able to get a head start on college applications in the summertime, and then maybe in the early fall, plan for some retakes either in August for the SAT or September for that first ACT. given the schedule there. So this is one timeline that could be plausible for a student that's kind of in this position or eyeing, you know, going light in fall and maximizing a lot of the spring studying. The next one that I have here, so okay, click here. The next one here is called the efficiency optimizer. So if we have a student who's trying to minimize the number of tests and maximizing our efforts here, recommended math would be Algebra 2 or higher. The SAT does cover up through that Algebra 2, so I think that would be a good place to be if we're looking at this timeline here. The PSAT prep would be, so we might plan for like light prep in the late summer and then take that PSAT in October. So over winter break, we can determine whether we'll do SAT or ACT preparation and then spread sessions out over the spring semester in order to prepare for the June SAT or the ACT. This would open up the opportunity to take retakes in the fall of 2021. So the SAT in one of those early months of their senior year. And of course, it depends from school to school what their deadlines are in terms of accepting, you know, latest tests. So definitely that's something that you either talk with your college counselor about, or if a student researches and comes to us letting us know, like, you know, my early decision school says that I can't take the latest test by this date. You know, we'll help plan accordingly for that. And when would it make sense to do retakes? The ACT, the fall retakes there, the opportunities there would be in September, October, and December. And then finally, like in fall of 2021 is typically at the start of that fall is when they do their college applications as a senior. So that would be another timeline here if we're looking to kind of minimize the number of tests there. And the last situation that I have here is like the recruited athlete. So here I think the main goal is to get the scores that you need for college admissions early. I know that some of my students have been in this position too, where recruiters kind of want to know where they're at, what their scores are, you know, if they haven't taken their test yet, when are you taking it and when can you get us some scores? So a good idea might be in early summer to determine which tests we're taking, right? So whether that's the SAT or the ACT, whether that means you're taking a hybrid diagnostic with us to kind of determine what that is, or talking with us more about your student to help us, you know, best advise on what it kind of seems that they might be best suited for, what timeline makes sense. So early summer, maybe determine which tests we'd like to prepare for. And then in August or September, you know, plan to take the SAT or the ACT and do that full prep during the summertime. So maximizing our time during the summer to really focus and zero in on, you know, our SAT or our ACT skills, which allows us to do retakes in the fall. So in the fall of their junior year, right? So either October or November, they can do the SAT or the ACT again. This would allow them to do the December SAT subject tests as well for Math 2 or Lit, which are two core ones that you know, are very easy to strategically get through if we have the background with Math 2. Literature is definitely a coachable one if the coach kind of requires this. So this is like kind of one timeline that does start a little bit earlier because many times those recruiters or coaches kind of want to see those scores early on in their junior year to know how we move forward through then. Through the rest of that year. So this might be another timeline that some of the students kind of go through. But what I wanted to share next is kind of what I map out when I'm sitting in a session with my student and I'm having a talk with them about, you know, what their year looks like and what makes sense. So my next slide here kind of gives you a big picture overview of when these exams take place. And so what I do is I actually just draw this out on the whiteboard, I map out the months, and I say, okay, this top row right here is kind of a picture of the tail end of summer here and our first semester. The second line here shows me my second semester. And what I'm asking them while we're mapping this out, and you guys will also get a handout that kind of has this calendar kind of mapped out for you with the dates. So we'll send that your way as well after this meeting so that you guys can kind of map this out with your own students. But what I do with my students here is I start putting other events that happen in these boxes, right? So I have students that, you know, always travel to, you know, one of my students travels to Canada every summer. So we'll put, you know, July is out of the question because that's usually when they're out of the country. Maybe students have a specific sports season, so maybe they're particularly busy during certain months. So we'll map that out and kind of look at what their schedules look like then. Some students are part of the spring musical, and so March and April are really busy for them, and it's impossible to get them in for sessions. And in that case, we'll want to kind of plan around that. And I think a lot of the time we're thinking about what's happening immediately. And so I think when I map this all out with a student and I show them, this is a picture of the year, these are the dates that we're able to take the SAT and the ACT. What do you think might make sense given the timeline, given your other commitments to your clubs, to your sports, to your travel, to your senior trip or your junior trip? What kind of makes sense here? So what I have outlined here are which tests are offered in which month. If you look at September and March, these are actually the only 2 SAT dates where you are unable to take an SAT subject test. So these dates for September and March, they're only offering like the full SAT instead of SAT subject test as an option there as well. So this, again, we'll be able to send to you guys so that you can see a big picture and a map similar to this one, and help plan with your students as well, just in terms of what makes sense for their timelines and what comes up during certain months with the school year. All right. So aside from that, we can certainly follow up with each of you individually if you have any questions about a particular timeline, or you'd like to discuss further what your student's timeline might be. Again, it's not one size fits all, and I think almost every student that comes through has a different timeline and has their own timeline to take into consideration, and we are happy to do that. We do that all the time with many of our clients year to year, and we're happy to help, regardless of whether your student is going to be a sophomore next year or a junior next year. We are certainly happy to talk a little bit more about what the options are there. So if you'd like, we can certainly follow up with you, and you can just drop a note to us or reach out to us directly and let us know that that's something that you'd like to talk about further, and we're more than happy to help map out a potential timeline. And so with that being said, I know that there are probably a couple of questions circling around score optional schools and, should I be taking the SAT or even worrying about it at this time? So I'm going to pass it off to John, who's going to talk a little bit more about that, and he'll fill you guys in on that.
Okay. Score optional schools is a question that was present on a lot of people's questions before the signups here before the seminar itself. The big thing to kind of consider here is score optional doesn't mean that the schools are not going to be considering scores. So for the current class, so many students have already taken their scores are still going to be counted. And they're not going to penalize students who weren't able to take tests and aren't going to be able to take tests. But that's kind of the major big takeaway here is doing away with a requirement is not the same thing as saying we're not going to look at your scores and not going to take that as part of the application process. So we're still recommending to all of our students, especially if they'd already done some of the prep, like many of our students had prepped for the March exam. That's typically the biggest SAT of the year. We're highly recommending students to continue to take those tests and go ahead and sign up for them as soon as they're available. And for students who haven't started prepping, who are current juniors or seniors who are just kind of waiting until the summer and had a little more time on their hands, we would still recommend that if you have the time and the ability to do the prep, that you definitely consider doing that and taking those exams, even if you are looking at going to a UC school, which has declared that for this coming year they are going to go test optional. A good thing to consider would be there's all sorts of optional activities that students do that are great differentiators for them when they apply to schools, whether that's participating in clubs or being on the swimming team or in the plays or whatever it might be. So those are very, very effective in sense of the ability to kind of help differentiate which students are academically achieving and which aren't, or which are just have a lot of drive to achieve whatever it is they're trying to work on. Currently, there are not too many schools that are test optional. There was a bit of a rush of schools that were going test optional for this year, but many of them are also only doing it for the coming year. The UC school system was a good example of this. When they announced they were going to be test optional for this current crop of class of 2021, they were basically saying that we're going to allow them not to take the tests and drop our requirement. Again, still recommending that students take them if they can, and still definitely recommend or letting students know that they will be considering those scores. But recently, at the findings released from the UC system, did come down saying like, hey, we think these are tests that are really do show, some differentiator between students who are going to succeed and who aren't. And the recent academic senate vote, I believe, was 51-0 for the UC school system to go ahead and keep the SAT and ACT for the coming years. So for students that are kind of looking at this current year and are in the class of 2021, we'd still say, hey, look at what they're saying for the coming years and plan on taking those tests and be nimble and be able to take them when they're open, so that you can take advantage of whatever ability you have to demonstrate your academic abilities. In the past, schools which are score optional, like University of Chicago, students typically still submit scores about 80% of the time. And so while they're not required, they're still definitely a huge part of the application process, and definitely something that students who will show well on these tests should definitely consider. On the other hand, if a student is someone who really struggles with standardized testing, this could be a time maybe to focus your energy elsewhere on your academics or your extracurriculars. But for the majority of students in the very competitive schools and environments around here are definitely in positions to score quite well on these standardized tests, and it's going to be a big help to their applications, not a hindrance. All right, so I'm sure there's more questions on that end, and I saw a few more popping up. So we're now going to open it up to Q&A a little more officially. And Chelsea, if you want to kind of pitch us questions here, we can go ahead and get started.
Yeah, so just kind of following up a little bit on what you were talking about earlier with the UC system. We did have a couple questions about the recent news around the president of the board trying to stop these tests for about 5 years. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So yeah, that was a recent development just a couple days ago. This is the president of the UC school system. She is someone who's been a fan of kind of leveling the playing field in her eyes and getting rid of these tests. But the committee that the UC system itself put forth brought back the recommendation that they should actually keep the tests. And again, the academic senate vote, I believe the academic senate, I forget what the different naming systems are, but that was maybe a couple weeks back, maybe 3-4 weeks now, was the vote that I alluded to, where it was actually a complete 51-0 listing of people who were in favor of keeping the test for now, and possibly at some point in the next 5-10 years developing a different test that the UC system might use that they might feel is a little bit closer to what they want to look at. The bottom line is they could totally decide to make these tests test optional for the foreseeable future, or even possibly do away with the requirement altogether. But we are recommending at this point that students plan on taking them and be ready, and definitely don't be caught, realizing at the last minute that you should have taken them and it's too late. And that's kind of the big bottom line. And one thing I'll kind of leave you guys with would be the subject tests have been this way for years for most schools. And they're still highly recommended by many, and definitely a big part of applications. There are a couple schools, like I believe someone mentioned MIT, which actually said we're not going to look at them this year. And possibly moving forward, but for many schools, many prestigious schools, it's still something that students, while they're not required to do, are definitely encouraged to do.
Thanks, John. And Kristen, continue on a little bit where you were talking about the timelines. We talked mostly about our rising juniors into our senior year. How might you recommend our current juniors prepare for this very condensed testing timeline that they're up against?
That's a great question. I actually think we have quite a few students in that boat right now. For students that have already been doing some sort of preparation with us, I would say it kind of depends on how far they're along in their prep. If they were prepping for June and then kind of went on a hiatus because of the cancellation to June, which was announced quite a few weeks before that actual exam happened, I would say getting back into the game and refreshing by either meeting with their tutor or starting to get in the groove of taking practice tests again after the academic year is over might actually be a great plan there to start at the beginning of summer. For any students who didn't have any prep. They planned to kind of take their SAT in March, May, or June, and see how that went before deciding whether or not they needed some preparation. I think considering either a full prep timeline over the summertime might be a good idea. So thinking about more holistically reviewing that, since the opportunities in the fall are a little bit more limited. I know that the SAT is opening, the College Board's opening up September in order to allot for what they're expecting is likely an influx of students that are going to need to make up these tests from the cancellations in March, May, and June. But I would say that, you know, taking your best chance at doing as much preparation as you can over the summertime where time allows, and preparing for, you know, what's going on or when they're going to take that exam in August. And of course, again, that registration opens this month, so definitely check College Board, check your emails to make sure that we can secure a seat for as early as you can. As far as I think somebody had asked about how they would prioritize registration, and I think the way that that would work is that the College Board would send emails to these students who are associated with having been registered in June and letting them know this is the week that you can go ahead and log on and register for your exam. So I would definitely keep track of the emails there. But as far as timelines go, for students that did like a full preparation for March, May, or June, and they're looking to, you know, kind of understand when should I be picking back up or what should I do in preparation for my senior year where I'm gonna take this exam now. I think maybe some light review beforehand, but allotting ourselves a good enough time so that if we're realizing that we're forgetting some of that content or not, you know, needing to take some more practice tests, we have the ample time to do that. So I would recommend for a full preparation, just to kind of sum up there, I know it's a lot coming from me, but a full preparation for students who haven't done any preparation yet, right? If they were just kind of winging it to kind of see what happens in March, May, and June, a full prep might be a good idea. For students that have done some preparation, a light preparation towards the middle or end of summer might be a good idea in advance of August or September.
Fantastic. And we, you know, kind of continuing in the vein of those fall tests, we've mentioned that they might potentially go to an online format. We also alluded to the fact that the AP tests are vastly different this year than they were you know, in previous years. Do you guys imagine, or have you heard anything about if the online administrations of the tests will be any different from the current administrations?
So as of now, we have not heard any information on that note. Both the ACT and College Board use language to the effect that was like, in the unlikely event that they are not able to host the tests. I think they're kind of banking on the idea that if schools can return to schooling in any capacity, considering how many kids, you know, go to a school on a normal day, it would be far easier for them to be able to go in and take these tests. You know, and they'd be able to take them in gyms and spread them out to any level they would need to. So the hope would be that they can host them as normal. There would definitely be concerns, you know, if students were taking multiple choice tests, you know, with security issues, and so I think they're, you know, really trying to, you know, their uttermost to make sure that we can, you know, host these in a safe, effective manner in person, as we've always done. But yeah, there definitely is that possibility. The College Board, like I said, has not made any announcement as to the nature of what the content of that test would look like. My guess it would be far similar to that than the AP tests were. The AP test they had to cobble together in a very short space of time. And also it's a test that's not meant to be comparable to any other year, like it's a one-year test. So, you know, changing that makes more sense. It's far more likely that the SAT would keep the same format that they have in the past, especially considering that many kids from the current class did take their test in the fall or in March. And, you know, so there's going to be very hard to compare the two if that were the case. So we're expecting them to be the same, whichever administration it is. But you know, if there is some change there, yeah, that is definitely a possibility, and it would largely be very similar content-wise, just like the AP test was, although the format was different. Students who prepared and did well all through the school year on their AP academic school year are the same kids that are going to get 5s on their AP tests. And we'd expect the same thing of students who prepare for the SAT. If there is some adjustment to the formatting, it would largely be the same students who were going to do well would still do well.
Fantastic. Returning to testing timelines, what would you guys suggest a sophomore or even a freshman be focusing on right now in regards to the SAT and ACT?
That's a great question. I think it kind of depends on where they're at. And so where we talked a little bit about it being very specific to a student, I think it just kind of depends. I've had a number of different students at these levels come my way. And some of those students are in really advanced math classes, which is why they're considering something like this early, in which case we can kind of dive into that a little bit earlier. As far as like what freshmen, so if we have like a rising freshman and they're starting to think about like the PSAT or the SAT, I want to say like focusing on zeroing in on reading comprehension skills and deeper analysis with more complex texts is usually something that I recommend to students that are kind of thinking about easing into the process a little bit earlier. That, and then definitely focusing on what's going on in math classes. A lot of what they learn in those first couple years or even the tail end of maybe some middle school years is going to be core to what's going to be covered on those exams down the line. So maybe doing some enrichment on that front if they're interested in maybe doing a little bit more study, like a little bit more of a lengthy study with something like reading comprehension or math. Or even writing, so essay writing, if a student feels like their skills in that area need some improvement. For a rising sophomore, I think that is a little bit, I think that might be a pretty common question too, because they are approaching like their junior year, which is one of the busiest years, getting through sophomore year. So kind of in the same vein there, we can focus a little bit on maybe some PSAT prep. If their school does administer like a 10th grade PSAT, that would be a great way to kind of ease into the process, is taking a preview of what the PSAT looks like, since the PSAT is just a shorter version of the SAT. So maybe doing some prep in the, in line with what content is covered on the PSAT, but again, focusing on maybe some of the enrichment. I find that if we're looking at SAT in particular, reading comprehension tends to be one section where many students find a little bit more difficulty than some other sections. So focusing a little bit more on enhancing those analysis skills is maybe a good idea for a student looking for something more on the enrichment side versus starting the test prep process early, which we can certainly do if that's something that the student's particularly interested in. But I think, again, it kind of depends case by case. I like to kind of hear a little bit more background on what kinds of classes the student's currently taking, what they've kind of shown to be like their strengths or their weaknesses, and kind of get to know a little bit more background on the student before I make a concrete recommendation on what kind of works. And then I don't know if you have anything to add to that, John, but that's kind of where my thoughts usually lie with freshmen and sophomores.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's a lot about building foundations. There definitely can be some times to do some brief test prep, but it's largely really getting that academic foundations really secured, unless the student is, a superstar, well advanced, and might be able to even take that test for credit in their sophomore year. But yeah, I think you're right on.
Fantastic. Well, we have time for a few more questions. So if we weren't able to get to your specific question or about your specific student, I've put up Kristen's and John's contact information. You can also find us on the website, and we'll be sending out a recap email after today's event. So you'll have our contact information and can ask more specific questions that way about your student's unique situation. Wanted to end with two questions, mostly around the same thing. So first off is, what does AJ do to prep a student for these tests? Like, what are they focusing on in their process? And then expanding on that, how is that working in the online environment, and how is that tutoring going? So let's start with how we prepare for tests.
Yeah, so I mean, we'll go with just a normal environment here. We at AJ try to be more efficient with time and be really, really respectful of that, because that in most times is the student's limiting factor. They're doing all these activities, and it's tough to have time to get any time in for their preparation for these exams. So we try to be really cognizant of that. This year, of course, students have all the time in the world right now, and it's a little bit different, but that's usually kind of our main focus. And to that end, we try to aim for no more than 10, 11, 12 sessions at most, typically to prepare a student in full for an SAT or an ACT. We also, envision that many students will be taking both tests, and we try to craft our prep so that it is a relatively short bridge to go between the two, and it's only 3 to 4 sessions if they do want to take the other exam. And then as far as the prep goes, we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach by any means, but But largely, the thing that is the same for almost every student is that they are, no matter what level of content ability they have in school, there's often, test taking technique, approaches, and strategies that they may not be aware of or may not have really, nailed down. And that is primarily what we focus on, especially in the beginning of our preps. So for the first half of most of the preparations, we're just getting familiar with the different aspects of the test and going over those main strategies that are going to, serve them well for any multiple choice exams. We do move into content where necessary, and so that's more of the not one size fits all approach. Some students need a lot more help with math content review or going over some of the tougher grammar rules, but that's kind of more of the secondary part. And a big thing that we do and really rely on students, because we are being a little bit more light on the actual time in the sessions, is we really rely on students doing quick focused homework. So we don't require students to do hours and hours and hours, but we do require them to do some homework in the between sessions to really, build on those skills. And then we do really recommend that students take practice tests. We offer free practice tests every weekend. Currently, we're hosting them in a virtual format, but we find that they are extremely valuable to getting great scores on these exams. Although again, everything in moderation. We typically are only recommending 3 to 4 in a normal stretch of time to prepare for that test. So it is a big outlay of time. We understand they're 4-hour exams, and we would never recommend to a kid that they need to take 10 to 15 of those in the course of a prep. But we do find that a few of them really help set the stage for students as they have to sit down for a real length 4-hour exam on the actual test day. And they're often really, really great milestone markers to get an idea of how students are doing. It's much more of a comprehensive look about the prep. As far as the online shift, largely what we've been doing with students is the same. We're still using, the same content, the same exact packets that we would do in a normal time frame. While we are hopeful we can get back into the office soon and, have the magic of being in person again, we understand that this is a tough time, and we do want to, proceed with the utmost caution and not risk health in any way. So we're happy to continue online as long as we need to with students. And largely students have actually been even more positive about this because it's something I think they look forward to at this time, and they're meeting with some instructor face-to-face one-on-one in a virtual manner. And largely that's been really successful. Primarily, we're still running the same homeworks. We're still having students, proceed with the same packets as I mentioned before. And we are now hosting the proctored exams. So largely that's felt the same. There's a couple, different things regarding like grading and things of that nature that are a little bit different, but for the most part, the structure of our sessions has remained the same. We still tend to spend the first, third of most of our lessons reviewing the previous week's homeworks, and then the latter half of our sessions to going over the new content and getting them ready to take their next exam or their next homework that they're going to be bringing in.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Kristen. And thank you all of you for attending today. As I mentioned, we'll be sending out a recap email with a recording of this, as well as our contact information and a little bit more of what we talked about today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out directly or give our main line a call. It's at the bottom there, 650-331-3251. We hope you have a great rest of your night. And again, thank you so much for joining us.